Hello everyone, welcome to Coding Decoded. For those who don't know me, I'm Sanchit Dudeja. I work at SD5 level at a top-notch MNC based out of Noida and have a total of 10 plus years of experience. You can call me a subject matter expert for building and architecting backend solutions for microservices for my company. From the video's title, you would have understood that it's all gonna be about OAUTH 2.0, and in case you still haven't subscribed to the channel, please do that. After watching this video, I can guarantee you a job at FANG. Guys, hold on. If someone says anything like this to you, then he or she is simply fooling you around. In order to gather views, some of these YouTubers offer these cheap gimmicks, and the whole motive of saying this is to catch your attention. But you have to be very cautious. I would suggest if someone says anything like this in any of the video, simply boycott that channel out, because for me, that person has lost the credibility. Pardon me for saying this, but if you follow those who sell themselves under the name of the company they work for, they're simply making a fool out of you. There's a very famous word often used in colleges that starts with C. तो वो सारे लोग तुम्हारा वही बना रहे हैं. ध्यान रखना इस बात का. And be cautious. Find good mentors in life because they have the ability to break or shape your career. Guys, बहुत सारी बातें इधर उधर की हो गई. Let's focus our attention onto OAUTH 2.0. You'll find plenty of videos about this on YouTube itself, but it's very sad कि किसी को भी proper clarity नहीं है कि actually OAUTH operate कैसे करता है. What is OAUTH 2.0? How does it work? And what are the parameters that are internally supported in and out? Nobody fully understands it and वो कुछ भी डाल देते हैं. So in this video, you are gonna learn each and every minute detail about OAUTH 2.0. So do watch it till the very end. And the last part is pretty awesome. We are gonna code it up end to end. बहुत सारे लोग आपको ये भी नहीं बताएंगे, तो इसको जरूर देखना. तो बात करते हैं, why do we need OAUTH? What is so special about it? So for this, let's do an experiment. Let's go to my google.com account management page and see what all security options are there. Under security, you'll find an interesting one that will says your connections to third-party apps and services. And if I go and see what all connections are there, then 8 apps in total have access to my Google account, and these are the ones that are listed over here. You can see Zomato is one of them. That means I have signed in into Zomato using my Google account. तो इसका सबसे बड़ा advantage ये होता है that you don't need to create an exclusive account on Zomato's database. What you tell Zomato, please check my authenticity using Google servers. And for this, you provide your Google credentials, wherein you get an option to sign in by Google and specify them over there. तो आज इसका एक डेमो करके दिखाता हूँ. You must be wondering, Zomato is trying to authenticate you to perform food bookings on their website using Google server. तो टोकन किसका यूज होगा? JWT टोकन इशू कौन करेगा? From the previous video, we know authorization tokens are based on the concept of JWT tokens. Now it's whose responsibility to create those JWT tokens? Is it of Google server or Zomato server? Guys, the answer is Google server. तो ये काम करता कैसे है? How does this workflow operate? Let's understand that, and this entire workflow end to end is based on the concept of OAUTH 2.0 protocol, which we are going to learn today. So let's go and check it out. To revoke my access for Zomato to use my Gmail account, and here I select Zomato and I want to delete all the connections that I have with Zomato. I click on the confirm button and it says you're no longer connected to Zomato. You can connect with it anytime again. So let's go ahead to zomato.in and let's try logging in using my Gmail account, the same one that I was logged in before. So let me go ahead and select login, and here I can see multiple options. I'll be selecting the one authenticating by Google, and when I open this, a new dialog opened, and this dialog is asking me to choose an account to continue in Zomato. So let me just open this in incognito. From this, we'll get to know that this dialog is being served by Google server, not Zomato server, because it is saying sign in with Google and sign in button to continue in Zomato. So something has been done between Zomato and Google for this OAUTH 2.0 workflow, which we will understand it. I'm just dropping you hints for now. It is asking me to provide the Gmail account, the Google account that I have in order to proceed ahead. The main area of interest for us is this URL. What all parameters are there in this? This will help us understand OAuth 2.0 protocol in great detail. Let me go ahead and copy paste this URL and let's try to read between the lines कि इसमें क्या क्या properties supported हैं, क्या क्या parameters supported है. It will help us understand the OAuth 2.0 workflow better. तो इसको ध्यान से देखना and let me just paste it over here. The area of interest lies in the query parameters. The first one is client ID. So client ID has been registered on Google's developer platform by Zomato's developer for the purpose of OAuth 2.0 workflow, and it is a mandatory thing to do. The client app registered होती है Google developer platform पे by any of the service provider who wants to integrate OAuth 2.0 workflow of Google. Zomato is one of them, and their client ID is this on production. The next parameter that I would like to highlight is redirect URI, which is a URL provided by Zomato in this client ID configuration itself, which tells कि जब token generate होंगे तो कौन से URL से होंगे, and this is its significance. I'll give details later in the video, but अभी से याद रखो. The next parameter happens to be response type. Here it is saying ID token. That means the response type will be ID token kind of a thing. And the last one is scope, which is provided as OpenID, email, and profile. What is the significance of scope? Do you remember the previous page that I highlighted over here? Third-party apps and services. Here there are two options where I'm signed in Google and what all access has been provided. And for example, if I go and select contacts, then Chromecast has the access, and those scopes parameters maps to this access. It is by virtue of those scopes itself that I'm able to select what all attributes of my Google account should be granted access to Zomato server. Now you must be wondering, where do these scopes actually get reflected in the OAuth workflow? तो आजो अभी दिखाता हूँ. So let's do a live demo of this. Let's go to zomato.com and let's try to log into it using my Google's account. And when I do that, you will see a dialog appears, and herein it is asking me whether I want to sign in Zomato using my Google account or not. And it is asking me if I continue ahead, then it will give the permission to Zomato to generate tokens on behalf of me and pass it on to the Zomato server. When I go to the Google management page, I can see Zomato listed over here. It came in because of the virtue of I signed into Zomato's application. And most of the times you would have seen a dialog where in the OAuth workflow itself, where it asks you for the permissions to access photos, to access calendar, and at that point of time when you say yes or continue, there and then itself the access to all those attributes of your Google's account get approved by you for Zomato to access. So far we did a live demo of a popular OAuth workflow between Zomato and Google's account. कुछ pointers तो definitely mind में बैठ गए होंगे that these are the important things involved, but still the picture is not yet clear. For this, let's deep dive into the HLD architecture of major steps involved, followed by a low level design of it. तो आ जाओ देखते हैं, बहुत मजा आएगा. This is a high level architecture of OAuth 2.0 workflow, wherein my client application happens to be Zomato in this particular case, Zomato web app. My authorization server happens to be Google, because I want to log in using my Gmail account. And let's try and understand the major steps involved. So the first step is that the Zomato application redirected us to Google's sign-in page. And this request is known as authorization request, which goes from the client application to the authorization server of a third party, which in this case happens to be Google. Now the control goes from Zomato's client application to Google server. The Google server will show the user a page asking for login. And as soon as a user logs into Google with their Gmail account, a pop-up will show up asking for permissions of various attributes Zomato is trying to access. Once the user gives those permissions, a continue button will be there, and once the user selects that continue button, an authorization code will be returned back to the client, which happens to be the Zomato web application. This is the most important step involved in the OAuth workflow. What is this authorization code? This authorization code is nothing but a temporary token. It's a temp token which helps the client application generate the user JWT token for various operations that can be performed further by the Zomato application using the Google's user token. This is step 2 of the process, where the Google server is returning back a temporary token to the client application for it to generate the access token of the user in future. So the third call, this third step involved happens to be from the client to again the Google server asking that I have a temporary auth code, please generate a token and give it to me so that the client application Zomato can perform further operations. And this request is known as access token request, which can only be made using authorization code. So in case any issue happens at the time of login, then this auth code will not be returned back to Zomato client application and the process is aborted there and then. This is the most important step. Again, I'm reiterating this. Auth 2.0 workflow cannot proceed without this step happening. What comes later on, once the access token request has been made and the Google server validates whether the incoming temporary code is correct or not for that particular user, whether it's valid or not. If it is valid, an access token is generated and returned back to the client, which happens to be Zomato web app. Once the client app has hold of the access token, it can access any of the resource on the resource server using, in this case, the Google APIs on user's behalf. So using this access token, any of the resource on Google's ecosystem can be accessed. Google Photos, Google Calendar, Gmail, G Drive, any of it, provided that scope has the required scopes in it. This was the high level architecture, how Auth 2.0 workflow actually operates. Now let's go a little deep. Let's see the LLD part, जो इससे ज़्यादा interesting है. और अगर ये समझ आ गया, if you have understood this much, then that will be way faster for you to understand because we are gonna evaluate each step in great detail. तो बहुत मजा आने वाला है. आओ देखते हैं. You must be wondering, in the Zomato workflow, I highlighted one parameter named client ID. In the HLD diagram, it wasn't shown. तो इन दोनों में connection क्या है? Where does client ID come into picture and what is its significance? Guys, it's a low level detail of Auth 2.0 workflow and ये workflow का बहुत important part होता है. It's a precursor for Auth 2.0 workflow to happen. So let's understand it. Let's go to auth.com and here they have provided us with the playground to mock everything related to Auth 2.0 workflow live. बहुत अच्छा लगेगा. आओ एक एक करके स्टेप समझते हैं. The foremost step, the precursor to Auth 2.0 workflow is registration of a client, and this will be done only once by Zomato's developers onto Google's platform. So let's go ahead and create a client ID and let's see what all parameters will be part of this. So it will have client ID, client secret, and it has also created an account for me, a mock account for me, so that I can play around with different things. Along with this, there's another parameter named as redirect URI. उसका भी significance बताऊंगा, but ये याद रखना, there are 4 parameters in total: client ID, client secret, redirect URI, and the last one is scope, which we have already discussed. It has created a mock account for me to log in into Auth workflow, and let's open it in a new window and we can save it for later. Let's go ahead and perform the Auth workflow. The first step was making a call from the client application to the authorization server, which is known as build me an auth code, authorization code. Let's proceed ahead to the first step of Auth 2.0 workflow and let's see what all parameters are to be passed in the first call to the authorization server for authorization request. Excuse me. The first thing over here is to understand the authorization URL, which will be dependent upon your authorization server. In our particular case, it would be some Google domain providing an API path for authorization request to be made. What all parameters will be part of this authorization call? Those are pretty standard in nature. The first one is the client ID through which the Zomato server is trying to perform the auth workflow, and it is by virtue of this client ID only, जो आपने sign in के time पे एक page देखा था ना, you are trying to log in Zomato using Google. वो that Zomato string came by virtue of this client ID configuration. The next one is the redirect URI. We talked about this redirect URI in the previous example as well, where I told you that it will be part of the client ID configuration. It is important because once the sign-in has been successful, the authorization server will again make a call onto the redirect URI, which will be the URL of the client application in order to send the auth code. तो इस URL पे ही auth code जाता है. which is a temporary token. The next one is scope. We talked about the significance of scopes in the past and you're aware of it. The topmost thing is this response type, which is equal to code, which means authorization code is being requested in this call. And the last one is a state parameter. अब state parameter को ऐसे समझो, when client machine is trying to perform the auth workflow, a random string is passed, which is usually a GUID or any string for that matter, and this state parameter is passed on to the call as a query parameter. In the response of the API call, which would be the authorization code onto this redirect URI, जब callback आएगा Google server से, authorization server से, again the state parameter will be passed in the request body, and at that point of time the client app will validate जो उन्होंने send करा था और जो Google से आया है, are these two equal or not? If those two are equal, that means a genuine 2 auth protocol has been established. Otherwise, if that has been tampered, something has went wrong in the middle and the auth workflow will be aborted. This state parameter is generally stored in the session store of the client application in order to validate once the callback comes from the authorization server. And let's proceed ahead to the next step. We need to enter the login credentials. Remember, the credentials were generated, mock credentials were generated for us, and let's copy paste those out. Let me just copy paste it over here and let's see what was the password. What was the password, guys? This is the password, and let's copy paste this. Let's log in, and it is asking me an application would like to connect to your account. So this is a similar dialog that I have created asking for permissions. Let me just approve for those permissions, and what's going to happen? A callback will be returned from the Google server to the client application, and therein the state parameter will be passed and a code, the temporary token will be generated, using which the client can further make the access token request. So let's read it out. The user was redirected back to the client, and you will notice a few additional query parameters in the URL. You need to first verify the state of the parameter matches the value stored in the user session so that you protect against CSRF attacks. So अगर कभी भी state parameter altered आता है, that means some attack has happened in the middle of auth 2.0 workflow and you should abort. I just told you before. Let's proceed ahead. It matches. I'm assuming the client has built the appropriate logic to match the state, and let's say it matches. What will happen next? An exchange of authorization code with access token call will be made. It will be a post call. It will be made onto the authorization server domain, and it could be the path would vary depending upon which authorization server are you using. It is Google or any other platform for that matter. Grant type is to be fixed authorization code. Client ID will be passed, secret will be passed, redirect URI will be passed, and auth code will be passed. These would be passed on in the API call, and if I click OK, let's get the response. A token has been generated for me. It is telling me the token type will be in the format of bearer, expires in, what is the expiry time, access token. I got the access token of the user. I got the scope information. It's variable. Usually access token also has this information in it, which we talked about in the JWT video. And the last one is a refresh token. So consider the case, what's going to happen when the access token expires. The client can make a further calls to generate the access token using the refresh token. So that's also another call that exists as part of the auth 2.0 workflow. And finally, we got the token. Using this access token, the client can further make calls onto the resource server. It has the JWT access token with it of the user, and it can ask for the protected resource. जो हमारे केस में Gmail, Google. This is a typical auth 2.0 workflow, which is a universally accepted protocol for generation of access tokens, wherein the authorization server happens to be different, the resource server happens to be different, and the client machine happens to be different. तो आ जाओ अब फाइनली इसको implement करके दिखाता हूँ कि कैसे करते हैं. As told before, the first step towards performing auth 2.0 workflow is registering the client ID on different developer platform console. It could be Facebook, it could be Google, or any other platform for that matter. What you need to do, you need to provide the client name. The client ID will be generated, its secret will be generated. Along with this, you need to tell the redirect URI while creating the client in the developer platform. So this is a very important step. I assume you have already done it by yourself, and now let's look at the coding section where these credentials will be added. Given your client has successfully been registered, I went ahead and I introduced few Spring properties, one for client ID, one for client secret, other one for client authorization grant type, which will be a static value equal to authorization code. These two values need to be updated as per what you get in the registration call. Going ahead, I provided the redirect URI and scopes parameters, and I kept them as part of my application properties so that I can anytime able to update those up given my requirements. Going ahead, I also introduced two properties. One is the authorization URI, that will be that of Google. I have just kept it as dummy https provider.com auth authorize, and I also added a token URL for exchanging the token with the auth code. I hope these properties are clear to you. Going ahead, what I did, I created a controller class, and we will see each of the APIs that I have exposed over here in great detail. So let me help you revise the concept first. The first step happens to be authorization, request authorization, using which we will generate an authorization URL with a state parameter. So what's going to happen? From your client, which will be a web app or a mobile app, a call will be made for request authorization. It will go to your server, your local server, and then you will return a URL. Once that URL has been returned, that has all the properties set appropriately, the client will make further call on that URL. It would be a get call, and the control will go on to the authorization server. So it's a two-step process. I have implemented over here happens to be the API that is responsible for generating that URL. So let's see that. I created my first API at the path API/auth/authorize, in which the first thing that I did was to create a random UUID that will act as my state parameter. I set the state parameter in my session. It could be present in my database, it could be an in-memory map, depending upon how much resources you want to consume. Usually databases or Redis happens to be a better choice. Going ahead, what did I do? I started creating a URL wherein I provided my client ID. So this is present in my application property. Using the added value annotation, I extracted and populated this value. And finally, I put it as query parameters in my authorization URL. This is a standard protocol of adding properties to your URL. Going ahead, I used the authorization URI that I have added in my application properties. I added the redirect URI. I added response type happens to be a code. So this is a standard. I added the scopes as well. What all scopes should be part of the token that will be eventually generated. And finally, the last step is adding the state parameter to it. Once the URL has appropriately been generated, what did I do? I sent it back to the caller, which will be my web app or mobile app, and then once the URL has been returned, it will be extracted and a call will be made onto it from the client machine, which would be a mobile or web app, and finally the control will land on the authorization server and the login page will be shown. Now comes the step 2 of the process. The end user will fill in its credentials in the form displayed, and on success, the authorization server will make an API call onto the redirect URI, passing the authorization code and state parameter. So this redirect URI would be something similar to API auth callback, and this value is what I provided in my redirect URI while defining my properties. Over here, the responsibility would be to receive the authorization code and verify the state parameter. So let's see its logic in action. So here the get mapping says /callback, wherein two parameters are present, code and state. And in this, what do? I check whether this auth state parameter, which I stored in while generating my authorization URL, is it same or not? If it is same, if it is not same, then I throw an error forbidden, invalid state parameter. Otherwise, I simply allow this authorization code to be healthy and pass it for further processing. Again, I remove my auth state parameter from my session because it can only be used once. Also, an intelligent thing over here would be to associate the session, the auth state parameter with some user ID, because it was generated for that particular user in that particular session. So another improvement that you guys can do over here is to tie it with user ID. अभी जो state parameter है, this has been successfully validated by our server and has been returned to the client machine, which is a web app or a mobile application. Now comes the last step of the process, which is get token call. The responsibility of this call is to exchange the authorization code for the access token. The API path that I've exposed in my server over here is /API/auth/token. And let's see the logic in action. Now the client will pass in the authorization code parameter in the API call /token to the local server, not authorization server. Its responsibility would be further to make the API call onto the authorization server to generate the token. And herein what all parameters will be passed. और एक और तुम्हारे पास क्वेश्चन आ रहा होगा माइंड में कि हमारे इस लोकल सर्वर की नीड क्या है. Guys, it's very important to understand the need of this local server, which I'm going to tell you by this code. What have I done over here? I have created a body which needs to be sent out in the API call for the exchange of token call. Wherein what all parameters will be passed? Authorization code will be passed, which has been validated before, that is in a happy state. I pass in the client ID, which is readable by anyone out there. I pass in the client secret. So this happens to be a sacred value. Client secrets do not usually travel over wire between client machines and the server. It usually gets transferred between server to server communication. And here in this case, our local server is acting as a protected layer for client secret to be passed. And that is why we need the server over here. We pass in the code parameter, we pass in the redirect URI. Once all these parameters have been set in the body, we make an API call onto the token URI, which I pushed correctly in my application properties over here. And then I further make a call onto this URL along with the request body. Once I receive the response, I check whether it is HTTP OK status or not. If it is status OK, then I extract the access token, the refresh token, the token type, and send it back to my caller, which happens to be a client machine. तो इतना समझ आ गया तुम्हें? ट्राई जरूर करो और देखो how different things are operating over here. I know we talked about multiple aspects of OAUTH 2.0 workflow, which might be difficult to digest in a single go, but I tried my best to help you explain each and every concept with backing. अच्छा लगा तुम्हें वीडियो तो don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel. A lot of energy and effort goes in creating those videos, and if you learned something new in this video, please guys leave a like, leave a comment. It will further boost me to create more such content. Token finally generate हो गया. Client can further make calls onto the resource server using the token issued for the user on behalf of third-party developer platforms, and now the whole process can work seamlessly. I hope you learned a lot in this. Thanks for watching and see you very soon within another interesting session. Tada!